Hi, I'm Alana, and on this channel we talk about biblical geography and other things related to Bible context. Today we are going to talk about the parables of Jesus. When I was in grad school, I took a couple courses with a rabbi on Jewish thought and practice. He also offered another course on the parables of Jesus, comparing and contrasting Jesus' teaching with that of different rabbis and generally giving a Jewish perspective. I never took that course, though I sat in on a couple of his lessons. But a few years ago, I had a chance to teach part of a women's Bible study on some of the parables, and I reached out to Rabbi Moshe, and he generously shared his current syllabus so I could do some self-study with his recommended sources. I also found a recording of him teaching on the parable of the Good Samaritan, so I'm going to link to that and highly recommend listening to what he has to say. Also, occasionally, Jerusalem University College offers online courses from Rabbi Moshe. If you want to experience more of his teaching, I would highly recommend that. I'll be sure to put links to both in the description. Since I've already done a lot of the work of studying the parables for that Bible study, I thought I'd reuse that and start a series on the parables here. This first video is just going to be an introduction to some of the things we want to consider as we study parables. I'll share some suggestions and resources if you want to do some study on your own. Next, I plan to demonstrate how to use those principles as we look at the parable of the vineyard owner in Matthew 20. And after that, I'll pick and choose parables as I want or based on requests I get. So if you are interested in a specific parable, please leave me a comment and let me know. Anytime we approach the Bible, it's helpful to think of the original context. In the case of the Gospels, we have at least two layers of original context to consider: the context in which Jesus spoke and the context in which the Gospel writer wrote. Here I've drawn a reminder that the context and order in which Jesus spoke is not necessarily the order that the Gospel writers used. They may have ordered things thematically rather than chronologically, for example. There's also been a language change. Jesus likely spoke mainly Aramaic, and the Gospels seem to have been written in Greek. This is not a problem, just a reminder that we have a lot of unknowns as we study, and therefore we need to be careful what assumptions we make. I just finished making several videos going through the physical context of the Gospel of John, and a lot of that will apply here as well, so I may make reference to certain aspects of those videos as we go along. Interestingly enough, the Gospel of John doesn't contain any parables, though that somewhat depends on how you define parable. We'll get to that. But typically, everything that is considered a parable is contained in one of the synoptic Gospels, Matthew, Mark, or Luke. Some of the parables are in all three of those Gospels and some in just one or two. Here is a chart depicting most of the things typically considered parables and where they are found. So let's talk about the context of the parables. This chart illustrates the layers between us and the original context. We're in the top layer, and we're going to try to peel back some of the layers between us and the bottom two layers. There are more layers than I've shown here. It's worth noting that many of the things we have read or been taught about various parables have been impacted by the way the church has tended to interpret them over the years. Oftentimes, those interpretations tended to allegorize the text, and a lot of those interpretations are wildly different than the original audience would have understood. For example, it's not uncommon to hear the claim that someone within a parable is meant to represent the church or a Christian. But when Jesus spoke, the church and Christianity did not exist yet. So it's pretty unlikely that his original audience would have understood it that way. It's also unlikely that it would have been understood that way by the first readers of the gospel. While all of the layers have significance to how we see the gospel today, the bottom layer is where I like to focus. I want to try to understand what the parable would have meant to its original audience as Jesus taught. This does require us to assume that the gospel writers did a decent job of translating and recording Jesus' words and the context in which he spoke. And that is an assumption. We especially see this when the same or similar parables are recorded in two different gospels. When this happens, there's often significant aspects of context that vary. Sometimes Jesus is recorded as being in different places in the two accounts, or maybe the parables are told in a different order, or the language used is different enough to give the parables a different emphasis. For example, consider these 4 lamp parables. They all have similar wording, but seem to have 3 distinct emphases. When things like this happen, there are a few possibilities. First, it's possible that Jesus told the same or similar parables several times in several locations and contexts, and different gospel writers were referencing different events. Second, it's also possible that Jesus purposefully composed the parables to be understood in a few different ways depending on the hearer. Third, I think the more common belief among scholars is that the 3 synoptic gospels were mainly based off the same source material, and each author just picked and arranged to suit their purposes and their intended audience. If this is the case, it makes it more difficult to know if the included context was relevant to Jesus's audience, or if it was used by the gospel writer to communicate with their audience. Still, the gospel writers were not so far removed from the actual events. We can't discount that they may have changed details for their own reasons, but it's not unreasonable to assume that the details were accurate as far as they knew. Their own geopolitical context was not so very different from the original context to cause that much of an issue. Before we go any further, we should perhaps define parable. This is not as straightforward as it may seem. Several simple, elegant definitions have been offered, but almost all of them are either too specific and leave out something that is usually considered a parable, or are too vague to offer any real value. For example, we could try the definition, a short story with a lesson. But not all parables are short. Not all of them are quite stories. Some might even argue that not all of them have lessons, or at least not clear lessons. For that matter, a fable could be considered a short story with a lesson, but are fables also parables? So we begin to see the problem. We could look at the etymology of the word, but there we run into the issue of parable being from the Greek, while Jesus taught mainly in Aramaic. The etymology of the Greek word may not be helpful to understand the Aramaic or Hebrew concept. Since the use of parable is not limited to Jesus, but was used by earlier prophets and by later rabbis, sometimes the Hebrew term is used instead, Mashal. Unfortunately, it is also tricky to define this exactly. It can be translated as parable, allegory, saying, proverb, fable, or even riddle. It was generally used to describe something that conveyed moral or spiritual truth with figurative language. In rabbinic literature, a mashal is often accompanied by a nimshal, which again is hard to translate exactly, but generally seems to be the explanation or lesson of the mashal. Some of Jesus' parables are also accompanied by an explanation or nimshal, but not all of them. I think it's worth us recognizing the difficulty of defining and differentiating parables, but maybe not worth trying to come up with the perfect definition. Generally, parables contain some form of figurative language, and they are used to teach a lesson or convey truth. That's enough to move forward with, especially since others have done a lot of the work of deciding what is and isn't a parable in the Gospels and providing lists. We can use our nuanced understanding to disagree with what they put on or left off those lists if we want to, but we don't need to reinvent the wheel. This difficulty of definition should also help us remember that just because we call something a parable, it doesn't mean we can treat it the same as all other parables. Some parables are metaphors, some are similes, some are partial or even full allegories, etc. We have to look at each parable individually and consider what kind of parable it is before trying to interpret it. Scholars have attempted to help this process as well by dividing parables by type. Unfortunately, they don't always agree. Most books that I've seen attempt any sort of organization tend to divide parables by topic. Parables of the kingdom, parables of salvation, parables about money, etc. This is both helpful and possibly problematic. By assigning a topic, we are already assuming to know at least part of the interpretation of the parable, and that assumption may be wrong or may cause us to miss something. John Crossan offers an alternative in his book by suggesting 3 main types of parables: riddles, examples, and challenges. This also points to a different method of interpretation for each, which again may be helpful or problematic. I don't want to get too into the weeds of comparing and contrasting how different people organize and categorize the parables, but it's worth being aware and taking all such categorizations with a pinch of salt. Let's talk about allegories for a minute. Generally, allegories are when a story represents or symbolizes something else. We might say, for example, that the Chronicles of Narnia are somewhat allegorical because Aslan clearly symbolizes Jesus. C.S. Lewis objected to classifying his books as allegories, though, and it's clear that they are not fully allegorical. For example, the White Witch is not clearly symbolic of Satan or Judas or Pontius Pilate or any one thing. She is a similar evil but set in a different world. Pilgrim's Progress, on the other hand, is meant to be an allegory. Characters are clearly named after the people or things they are meant to represent. When it comes to the parables of Jesus, the pendulum has swung from the belief that all the parables are allegories to none of the parables are at all allegorical to a more moderate middle position, where most scholars seem to fall today. We know that at least some of the parables have at least some aspect of allegory. In the case of the parable of the sower, Jesus explains that the seed represents the word of the kingdom. Or we can look at Nathan's parable to David about the poor man's lamb stolen by the rich man, and then followed by Nathan's clear statement, "You are the man," telling us again that some level of allegory was clearly intended. We have to be careful if we seek to take the allegory further, though. In Nathan's parable, we might guess that the poor man represents Uriah and the lamb represents Bathsheba, but we could equally well assume that the lamb represents Uriah since he's the one who ended up losing his life. It's hard to know if Nathan intended the lamb to represent either or both of the injured parties in reality, or if David would have understood it that way. We all clearly understand the main point, though. David has done wrong. Trying to extrapolate more from the parable by guessing at exactly who represents what could lead us astray. Trying to assign symbols that are not clear in the text is called allegorizing. Unfortunately, the church has a history of doing exactly that with the parables of Jesus. Just look at Augustine's take on the parable of the Good Samaritan. A certain man went down from Jerusalem to Jericho. Adam himself is meant. Jerusalem is the heavenly city of peace from whose blessedness Adam fell. Jericho means the moon and signifies our mortality because it is born, waxes, wanes, and dies. Thieves are the devil and his angels, etc. To give Augustine some credit, he is essentially using the parable to try to retell the story of the Bible. Some of what he says is a bit problematic, but mostly he's just summarizing the gospel, which is probably why other theologians more or less went along with this for centuries.
What he's saying is it's nonsense in this context, but at least it's not heresy.
The problem is that if we focus on this supposed secret hidden meaning of the parable, we may miss the plain meaning of the parable, the way the original audience would have understood it. And, of course, the other problem is that once we start allowing allegorized interpretations, people can make a parable mean just about anything they want it to, even in contradiction of the plain meaning. So, it's okay to look for places where allegory may come into play, but it's wise to approach it cautiously. Don't force anything and try to keep in mind how the original audience would have understood it. Now that we've got a few of the guardrails and warnings in place, let's take a look at a general approach to studying a parable. Here are roughly 5 steps that I would suggest, and we'll go through these in order. First, read the parable. Preferably, read it in a few different translations, and preferably in its immediate context. What is happening before and after it? If you know Greek, feel free to read it in that language, or if not, you can look at an interlinear to see if any words stand out as significant, though we can do this later too, if questions come up. If you don't actually know Greek, do be aware that interlinears provide helpful information but are not exhaustive. Consult with someone who knows Greek before making any large departures from accepted translations. Second, as you read, ask questions. Learning to ask the right kinds of questions can make a huge difference. Here are some examples of questions to ask, though this is not an exhaustive list. And special thanks again to Rabbi Moshe, whose questions from class I have adapted. First, what stands out to you? Is something obviously emphasized or repeated? If you haven't looked at the original language yet, this might be a good place to look up specific words. Second, what seems strange or out of place? This is a great place to keep in mind the original audience. A lot of the imagery Jesus used would have been familiar to them, but often in the parables, something departs from the norm. What is going on that would have been seen as normal, and what is going on that is out of place or strange? 3, do you see any problems or have questions? What is clear or unclear? What seems like it should have happened a different way? 4th, any scripture passages that are referenced or that come to mind? If the parable you are studying is in Matthew, does a similar parable occur in Mark or Luke? Or is there any place in the Hebrew Bible that is possibly being quoted or referenced? Is there any place in the New Testament that appears to reference this parable? More broadly, we can look at the whole of Jesus' teaching and ask how this lesson might fit into it. It shouldn't contradict anything else he said. 5th, what would be the best title for this parable? Often different Bibles will offer a heading with a suggested parable title, but sometimes different translations will suggest different titles, and the title used might lean us towards one interpretation over another. What title is typically used for the parable you are studying? Is it misleading in any way? Do you think there would be a title that would work better? And 6th, who do you immediately empathize with? Amy Jill Levine suggests that parables are meant to comfort the afflicted and afflict the comfortable. And if you read a parable and it doesn't make you uncomfortable, then either you were already very afflicted, or you should maybe read it a little more closely. There should be things in parables that bother us and make us uncomfortable. Third, once we have some things to ask and look for, we can start to do some research to try to find some answers. And here is where I suggest starting to look at how others have interpreted it. I would start by reading some of the commentaries I have access to. Here are a couple suggested ones that I have found helpful. But if you don't have immediate access to commentaries, you can start by looking online for sermons, podcasts, or blog posts that address the parable. Of course, as always, take anything you find on the internet with a grain of salt, especially if it's not known as a reputable source. This is why I always try to provide sources and a bibliography for my videos. I don't want you to have to just take my word for anything. If you have time and energy, I recommend looking up some more academic sources. I can use my local library account to sign into JSTOR to look for articles there, or you can try academia.edu, as some scholars provide free access to their published papers there. For books, I always recommend looking at your local library. If they don't have the specific books you want, they may be able to get them through interlibrary loan. Another great place to check is the Internet Archive. For example, you can access this book. And that brings me to my next research suggestion. Look for similar parables from around that time and place. Christians like to think of the parables of Jesus as utterly unique, and in some ways they are. But Jesus was not the first to teach in parables, nor was he the last. There are some parables in the Hebrew scriptures. We've already mentioned the one told by Nathan. And it seems that the practice of rabbis teaching in parables arose before or around the same time that Jesus was teaching. I'm not sure if we can say for sure exactly who was imitating who in each case, but there are several parables with interesting parallels to those told by Jesus, and we can learn something by comparing them. Occasionally, it may also be helpful to look at other similar literature like Aesop's fables. If you are not already familiar with rabbinic literature or ancient Near East literature, this is not necessarily an easy step. There are resources out there. I got a few books through interlibrary loans, and of course there are numerous things you can access online. But if you don't know exactly what to search for, the right information can be elusive. But there are getting to be more and more resources. I have put this last,
which perhaps I should have mentioned first,
because it really is the framework of everything we are trying to do here. As we look at the parable, we must remember that it was told to Jews, not to Christians. It was told to first century people, not 21st century. It was told to people who lived in more agrarian and rural contexts, not the urban or suburban context of most modern populations. It was spoken in Aramaic and translated into Greek, not modern English. Throughout this process, we want to strive to keep the broader context or contexts in mind. For example, next time we are going to talk about a parable in Matthew that involves a vineyard. So we will look at what vineyards of Jesus' time may have looked like and how they may have functioned. We'll look at other Jewish literature that may contain vineyard stories and see how they compare and contrast to this story. We'll also, to a lesser extent, try to keep in mind Matthew's context. Who was he trying to communicate to, and how might he have adjusted the words and imagery to better communicate to them? We should also keep in mind the context of authors and commentators that we read. A commentator writing in California in the 1990s might have a different image of vineyard in mind than Jesus or Matthew would have had, for example. Hopefully, this has been a helpful overview of what to look for and what to avoid when studying the parables of Jesus. We will try to apply some of this next time as we look at the parable in Matthew 20, verses 1 through 16. Feel free to read and study ahead. If you are interested in studying a specific parable together, leave a comment and let me know which one. And if parables aren't your thing, let me know if you are interested in something else specific. I have several other ideas I am also working on, so other videos with other focuses will be coming along shortly. As always, thank you for watching, have a lovely day, and pay attention to your context.